The Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport hummed with its familiar pre-dawn energy. Coffee shop workers prepped the first batches of the day while maintenance crews guided planes across wet tarmac. Business travelers checked phones impatiently. Families struggled with oversized luggage, and somewhere in Gate 18, Sophia Mitchell stood quietly in the boarding line, her carry-on bag resting against her leg. To anyone watching, she appeared unremarkable. Mid-30s, athletic build, wearing a simple navy jacket and jeans. Her boarding pass read Seat 12B, middle section, Flight 847 to Portland. Just another passenger heading north on a Tuesday morning. But Sophia carried a pass that no one on that aircraft could have imagined. She had once commanded the sky itself. Years earlier, Sophia had been among the top 5% of Air Force pilot candidates at Randolph Base in Texas. Her instructors praised her spatial awareness, her calm under simulated emergencies, and her ability to process multiple crisis scenarios simultaneously. She had logged over 400 hours in advanced flight simulators and was weeks away from earning her wings when everything changed. During a routine evaluation flight, her commanding officer questioned her emotional stability during a particularly challenging night navigation exercise. Despite completing the mission flawlessly, she was told that her tendency to overthink in crisis situations made her unsuitable for combat aviation. The recommendation was transfer to ground operations or discharge. Sophia chose discharge. That was 8 years ago. Since then, she had built a successful career in cybersecurity, troubleshooting complex network failures for tech companies. Her analytical mind, the same one deemed too cautious for military aviation, now solved digital emergencies from behind a computer screen. Flying had become something she did as a passenger, a comfortable distance from the responsibility she once craved. As Flight 847 taxied toward the runway, Sophia settled into her middle seat between a businessman typing aggressively on his laptop and an elderly woman clutching a romance novel. The engines spooled up, that familiar whine she remembered from her training days. For a moment, muscle memory kicked in. She found herself mentally calculating takeoff speed, checking wing flex through the small window, noting the crosswind correction. Then she forced herself to relax. Those days were behind her. The first hour passed uneventfully. The businessman fell asleep. The elderly woman marked pages in her book, and Sophia reviewed quarterly security reports on her tablet. Below them, the Arizona desert gave way to Nevada's mountains, then California's agricultural valleys. The flight attendants served drinks. Everything routine, predictable, safe. Then the plane lurched. It wasn't turbulence. Sophia knew turbulence. This was mechanical. A harsh vibration that traveled through the airframe like a warning. Her fingers instinctively gripped the armrest. Around her, other passengers glanced up with mild concern, but continued their activities. The businessman didn't even wake up. Sophia's trained ear caught something else, a subtle change in engine pitch. The left engine was running rough, irregularly. She tilted her head, listening. There, a slight miss in the rhythm, like a heartbeat with an extra beat. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, steady but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor mechanical issues. We're going to level off here while we run through some checklist items. Flight attendants, please remain seated for now." Minor mechanical issues. Sophia's jaw tightened. In aviation, minor was often code for, "We're handling something serious, but we don't want panic." She looked toward the cockpit door, noting how the lead flight attendant's smile seemed forced as she secured the beverage cart. Then came the second indication. The plane began a gradual but noticeable descent. Not the controlled descent toward destination, but the kind of altitude loss that meant lost power. The businessman woke up, annoyed. "Are we there already?" "No," Sophia said quietly, still listening to the engines. "We're not." 10 minutes later, the plane shuddered violently. Overhead bins popped open, sending personal items tumbling into the aisles. The elderly woman dropped her book and clutched Sophia's arm. "What's happening?" Before Sophia could answer, the oxygen masks dropped. The cabin erupted in gasps and nervous laughter, the kind people make when they're scared but hoping someone will tell them it's just a drill. A baby started crying. Someone in the back shouted, "Is this normal?" From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing for more tales of unrecognized heroes. It wasn't normal. Sophia knew emergency procedures, and oxygen deployment meant serious cabin pressure issues or significant altitude loss. She looked out the window. They were definitely descending, and fast. The mountain peaks below were getting uncomfortably close. A flight attendant stumbled past, trying to maintain composure while helping passengers with their masks. Sophia caught her attention. "What's the situation?" she asked, her voice calm but authoritative. The flight attendant paused, something in Sophia's tone making her stop. "Engine failure. We're declaring an emergency." "Both engines?" I don't know the details." Sophia unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. "I need to speak with the captain." "Ma'am, you need to remain seated. I'm a trained pilot. Former Air Force. If they need assistance, I can provide it." The flight attendant studied her face, saw something there that made her nod. "Wait here." 2 minutes felt like 20. Around her, passengers were following emergency instructions with varying degrees of panic. The businessman was now wide awake, photographing the chaos with his phone. The elderly woman was praying quietly, still gripping Sophia's empty seat. When the flight attendant returned, her face was pale. "The captain wants to see you. Now." Sophia moved through the cabin, past crying children and terrified adults, her military training automatically assessing the situation. No smoke, no unusual odors. Structural integrity seemed intact. Whatever was happening, it was mechanical, not catastrophic. Yet. The cockpit door opened to reveal organized chaos. Warning lights blinked across every panel like an angry Christmas display. Captain Richards, a gray-haired veteran with sweat beading on his forehead, looked up as she entered. "You're the pilot?" he asked, voice hoarse from stress. "Sophia Mitchell, former Air Force, certified on multiple aircraft types. What's your situation?" Richards motioned her toward the right seat, where the first officer was slumped forward, conscious but pale and breathing heavily into an oxygen mask. "Brad here is having chest pains. Might be anxiety, might be more serious. I've got complete failure on the left engine, partial power loss on the right, and hydraulic problems across multiple systems." Sophia slipped into the first officer's seat, her hands automatically finding familiar positions on the instrument panel. The layout was different from military aircraft, but the fundamentals were the same. Altitude, airspeed, heading, engine parameters, all the critical information that kept machines in the sky. "We're 34 minutes from Portland, but we won't make it," Richards continued. "Lost too much altitude, and the remaining engine can't maintain level flight with our current weight." Sophia scanned the navigation display. "Emergency airfields?" "Closest suitable strip is Cascade Regional, but it's 28 miles southeast, and we're losing altitude fast." She pulled up the terrain mapping on the backup display, her mind calculating glide ratios, wind factors, and approach angles the way she used to solve cybersecurity puzzles. Systematically, thoroughly, calmly. "There," she said, pointing to a small symbol on the edge of the screen. "Eagle Point Airfield, decommissioned military strip, northeast about 15 miles. Long enough for emergency landing if we can reach it." Richard stared at the display. "That's not in our emergency procedures." "How do you know about it?" "I studied every airfield within 200 miles of major routes during my training. Military habit." She was already calculating approach vectors. "It's our best option. Maybe our only option." For a moment, Richards hesitated. Regulations, procedures, and chain of command all said he should be making these decisions. But regulations hadn't anticipated a former Air Force pilot sitting in his right seat during a dual-engine emergency. "Talk me through it," he said. Sophia's hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency. "We adjust heading to 270. Begin controlled descent at 500 feet per minute. I'll handle approach calculations. You manage what's left of our power." She paused. "Captain, I need you to know. I washed out of flight training, told I couldn't handle pressure situations." Richards looked at her steady hands, her calm voice, her focused attention on the instruments. "Well," he said, "let's see if they were wrong." The next 20 minutes tested every skill Sophia had learned and every instinct she'd been told to suppress. Together, She and Richards nursed the damaged aircraft through mountain passes and around weather systems, constantly adjusting their approach to Eagle Point Airfield. Below them, emergency crews were racing to the abandoned airstrip. Local fire departments had received the distress call and were setting up whatever lighting they could manage: vehicle headlights, portable flares, anything to help guide the aircraft home. "Gear down," Richards called. Sophia moved the landing gear lever. One green light, then two, then nothing. Main gear shows down, nose gear uncertain. "We're landing anyway." The runway appeared ahead, a narrow strip of cracked asphalt surrounded by tall pine trees. It looked impossibly short, impossibly narrow, impossibly risky. Sophia had landed on military training strips before, but never in a commercial aircraft with failing systems and 150 passengers behind her. "Airspeed 140, descent rate 800, she called out. "Too fast, too steep," Richards replied. "I know, no flaps, limited engine power, we're coming in hot." Her voice remained steady despite the chaos. "But we're coming in." The plane crossed the threshold at 20 feet, still descending rapidly. Sophia pulled back on the yoke, trying to flare for landing, fighting the aircraft's tendency to nose down with partial engine failure. The main landing gear touched first, then the aircraft bounced slightly before settling. The nose gear, damaged but functional, made contact with a metallic screech that echoed through the cabin. Without full hydraulic power, Richard stood on the brakes while Sophia deployed every drag-producing device still operational. The aircraft rolled down the short runway, past the makeshift lighting, past the fire trucks and emergency vehicles, and finally lurched to a stop less than 100 feet from the tree line. For several seconds, the cockpit was completely silent, except for the sound of cooling engines and distant sirens. "We're down," Richard said quietly. "We're down," Sophia confirmed. Behind them, the cabin erupted in cheers, tears, and applause. Passengers hugged strangers, called loved ones, and tried to process what had just happened. They had survived something that shouldn't have been survivable. But in the cockpit, Sophia Mitchell, the former Air Force trainee who had been deemed unsuitable for crisis situations, was just glad everyone was going home. The evacuation was swift and professional. Emergency slides deployed. Passengers moved in orderly lines despite their obvious relief and excitement. A few minor injuries, bumps, bruises, one sprained wrist, but no serious casualties. The first officer was taken by ambulance for observation, his chest pains attributed to stress and altitude changes. Sophia was among the last to leave the aircraft. As she stepped onto the portable stairs brought up to the door, she found herself face to face with a wall of flashing cameras and reporters who had somehow reached the remote airfield ahead of the official investigation team. Ma'am, how does it feel to be a hero? What went through your mind during the landing? Will you be returning to aviation?" She paused on the steps, looking back at the aircraft that had just become a permanent part of her story. The damaged engines, the buckled nose gear, the scorch marks on the runway behind them, evidence of an impossible landing that had somehow worked. "I'm not a hero," she said quietly to the crowd below. "I was just a passenger who happened to know how to help. Captain Richards deserves the credit. He never lost control, never gave up, and trusted someone he'd never met to help save his aircraft." A reporter pushed forward with a microphone. "But you were discharged from the Air Force for inability to handle pressure situations. How do you respond to that assessment now?" Sophia looked directly into the camera. "I respond by saying that sometimes the system gets it wrong. Sometimes, what looks like overthinking is actually thoroughness. What looks like emotional instability is actually caring deeply about the outcome. And sometimes, the person you least expect to handle a crisis is exactly the person who can." She walked down the remaining steps and away from the cameras, toward the quiet area where survivors were being interviewed by investigators and comforted by family members who had driven through the night to reach the remote airfield. Captain Richards found her sitting on the back bumper of a fire truck, still wearing her oxygen mask around her neck like a strange necklace. "The FAA investigators want to interview you," he said, sitting beside her. "I figured they would. They'll probably offer you your wings back. Full reinstatement, advanced training, fast track to commercial certification." Sophia was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun rise over the mountains. 8 years ago, I would have given anything to hear that. Today, I'm not sure what I want. Richards nodded. You've got time to decide. But I want you to know, in 30 years of flying, I've never seen anyone handle emergency procedures like that. Calm, focused, analytical. Whatever they told you about not being suited for pressure situations, they were dead wrong. Maybe, Sophia said. Or maybe I just needed the right kind of pressure. Over the following days, Sophia Mitchell became a household name. The story of the cybersecurity expert who saved Flight 847 spread across social media, news networks, and aviation forums. Reporters dug into her background, interviewed her former instructors, and turned her into a symbol of perseverance and second chances. But Sophia avoided most of the attention. She declined talk show appearances, turned down book deals, and refused offers from major airlines eager to capitalize on her fame. Instead, she did something unexpected. She started teaching. Using the settlement money from the airline's insurance company, offered to avoid lawsuits from the emergency landing, Sophia established the Mitchell Aviation Academy, a flight training program specifically designed for students who had been told they weren't suited for aviation careers. Too emotional. Overthinks situations. Lacks confidence. Not command material. She had heard them all, and now she sought out students who had been dismissed for the same reasons. The Academy's motto, painted on the side of the hangar in bold letters, read, "Sometimes the system gets it wrong." Marcus Chen was one of her first students. He had been a passenger on Flight 847, seated in 23F, and had watched Sophia walk calmly toward the cockpit while others panicked. At 19, he had already been rejected by 2 flight schools for inability to multitask under pressure, and was working at his family's restaurant to save money for another attempt. "I saw what you did up there," he told her during his application interview. "The way you didn't panic, didn't rush, just figured out what needed to be done. I want to learn how to do that." Sophia looked at his previous training records, saw the comments about his methodical approach and tendency to double-check everything, the same criticisms that had ended her military career. "Those aren't weaknesses," she told him. "They're superpowers. We just need to teach you how to use them." The Mitchell Aviation Academy grew slowly but steadily. Students came from across the country, many of them women and minorities who had been discouraged by traditional aviation programs. Sophia taught not just flying techniques, but confidence, decision-making under pressure, and the kind of analytical thinking that had saved Flight 847. 2 years after the emergency landing, Marcus Chen became her first graduate to be hired by a major airline. He sent her a photo of himself in his pilot uniform, standing in front of a Boeing 737, with a simple note: "Thank you for teaching me that different doesn't mean wrong." That same week, Sophia received a call from Colonel James Harrison at Randolph Air Force Base. "Ms. Mitchell, I believe we made a mistake 8 years ago. I'd like to discuss correcting that mistake." Sophia sat in her office at the Flight Academy, looking out at the training aircraft where her current class of unsuitable students was practicing emergency procedures. "Colonel, I appreciate the call, but I'm not interested in reinstatement." "May I ask why?" "Because I found something better than flying for the military. I'm flying for people who were told they couldn't fly at all." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I understand, but the offer stands, should you ever change your mind." "Thank you, Colonel. But I think I'm exactly where I belong." As she hung up the phone, Sophia looked at the wall of her office, covered with photos of her graduates, letters from students, and newspaper clippings about the emergency landing. But the item that meant the most to her was a simple handwritten note from Captain Richards. "To the passenger who became a pilot when we needed her most. Thank you for proving that heroism isn't about never being afraid. It's about acting despite the fear." 5 years after Flight 847, Sophia Mitchell stood in front of a new class of flight students at the Mitchell Aviation Academy. They were the usual mix: young people who had been told they weren't pilot material, older adults pursuing delayed dreams, and a few who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time when opportunities were distributed. "How many of you have been told you're not suited for aviation?" she asked. Every hand in the room went up. "Good," she said with a smile. "Then you're exactly where you belong, because sometimes The person who everyone says can't do something is the only person who actually can. Sometimes, what the system calls a weakness is actually your greatest strength, waiting for the right moment to emerge. She moved to the whiteboard and wrote a single word: adaptability. This is what saved Flight 847. Not perfect training, not following procedures exactly as written, but the ability to adapt when the situation demanded something new, to think clearly when others panic, to trust your instincts when the textbook doesn't have an answer. One student raised her hand. "Ms. Mitchell, do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been on that flight?" Sophia paused, considering the question she'd been asked hundreds of times by reporters, investigators, and students. "I think someone else would have stepped up," she said finally. "Maybe a flight attendant with medical training, maybe a passenger with military experience, maybe just someone who refused to accept that there was no solution. That's what people do in crisis situations. They rise to meet the challenge, often surprising themselves with what they're capable of." She looked around the room at the eager faces, each representing someone who had been dismissed or discouraged but had chosen to try again. The real lesson of Flight 847 isn't that I was some kind of hero. It's that when the moment comes, and it will come in all of your lives, maybe in an airplane, maybe somewhere else entirely, you'll discover that you're stronger, smarter, and more capable than anyone ever told you, including yourself. After class, as she was closing up the academy for the day, Sophia found a package waiting on her desk. Inside was a pilot's helmet, custom painted with the call sign Phoenix, and a note. "For the pilot who rose from the ashes of other people's doubts, thank you for teaching us to fly. Your students." She held the helmet, remembering the 8-year-old girl who had first dreamed of flying, the determined cadet who had pushed through training, the young woman who had been told she wasn't good enough, and the passenger who had found herself back in a cockpit when lives depended on it. But most of all, she thought about the teacher she had become, someone who helped others discover that their perceived weaknesses were actually their hidden strengths. As she locked the academy and walked to her car, Sophia looked up at the evening sky where a commercial airliner was leaving a contrail across the sunset. Somewhere up there, she knew, were pilots who had been told they couldn't fly, passengers who were afraid, and crews who were prepared for whatever challenges might come. The system hadn't gotten it wrong about her after all. It had just taken 8 years for her to find the right system, one where being thorough, analytical, and emotionally invested in the outcome weren't weaknesses to overcome, but strengths to celebrate. And in the end, that had made all the difference.